At 10:46 on a windless Tuesday night in March of 1989, Benton Price stepped through the side door of the Port Arden Harbor Police Building with his tie loosened, his hair damp from sea mist, and a silver operations clipboard tucked under one arm. He did not come in shouting. He did not stumble. He did not look like a man who had been caught by surprise. What he carried into the fluorescent lobby was a quieter kind of alarm, the kind that made the desk sergeant lower his coffee cup before anyone said a word. Benton was the night operations director for Meridian Shore Airways, a small regional airline that flew fishermen, nurses, school teachers, freight clerks, and island families between the mainland and the weather-beaten communities scattered across North Ledgewater Sound. Everyone in Port Arden knew the airline's blue-tailed planes. They crossed the bay so often that children could identify the engine hum before they could name the birds over the breakwater. That night, Benton told the harbor police that Flight 217 was gone. The plane, a twin-engine commuter aircraft with 11 souls aboard, had left Port Arden Municipal at 8:32 p.m., bound for Turnhaven Island. It should have been a 46-minute flight over the dark channel, a routine hop made thousands of times before. According to Benton, the pilot had reported instrument trouble at 8:58. At 9:04, there had been a fragment of a distress call. At 9:07, the transponder had vanished from the civil radar screen somewhere beyond the outer buoy line. Benton laid out the details in a careful sequence, as if placing fragile glass on a table. Captain Elias Cade was at the controls. First Officer Tova Sen sat beside him. Cabin attendant Nadia Pell was in the narrow aisle behind them. 8 passengers were listed on the manifest: a traveling dentist, a mother and her teenage son, a fisheries inspector, a retired nun, a salesman with sample cases, a dock electrician, and a 31-year-old revenue auditor named Iris Callow, who had boarded at the last minute with a brown briefcase and no checked bag. The desk sergeant wrote the names down slowly. The clock above him made a small scraping sound every time the minute hand moved. Benton said the weather had closed in faster than forecast. He said the crew had been talking about a generator problem. He said the captain might have turned east to keep the aircraft away from the cliffs. He said the last sound over the radio was not a scream, but a burst of engine static, followed by 3 words no one in the tower could swear to completely. Going down. Now. He said the airline had already called the Coast Guard. He said boats were moving toward the search grid. He said he had come personally because the families would need police assistance before morning. His voice broke once, only once, on the word families. That break was what people remembered later. It made him believable. It made him human. Benton Price was not a large man, but he carried himself with the steady posture of someone who understood emergencies. He had been a pilot before an inner ear condition grounded him. He knew radio procedure, fuel burn, wind drift, and grief. He knew which forms had to be filed before dawn and which relatives had to be kept away from the airport windows. When Detective Ione Sharp arrived from home, still buttoning her coat, Benton gave the same story again, without needing to consult his notes. His eyes were red. His hands trembled around a paper cup. He told her he had known Elias Cade for 14 years. He told her Elias was good in weather, but proud. He admitted, almost reluctantly, that the captain had been under strain. Debts, a disciplinary warning, and rumors about unpaid poker markers in Turnhaven. He did not accuse Elias directly. He only opened the door and stood aside while suspicion walked in. By midnight, the local news had the words "missing at sea" across the bottom of the screen. By dawn, the first pieces of floating debris were spotted south of Marker 6. Seat foam, a strip of blue interior panel, a child's red scarf, a torn safety card from Meridian Shore Airways, and a section of galley curtain stained with hydraulic fluid. The sea gave up just enough to make the story hold together, but not enough to give anyone peace. For 6 days, boats traced long squares over slate-colored water. Helicopters swept the chop with spotlights. Families stood behind barricades at the harbor terminal, while reporters filmed them through rain-streaked glass. The airline arranged coffee urns, cots, clergy, and grief counselors. Benton Price moved among the relatives like a man punishing himself with duty. He learned names. He folded blankets. He stood beside Iris Callow's older sister, Nola, while she stared at the search map and asked why the grid was all water when Iris had once told her she hated flying over the channel. "Because that is where the aircraft was," Benton answered. He did not look at the map when he said it. He looked at Nola. The first official report took 4 months. It found that Flight 217 had likely suffered a cascading electrical failure, followed by spatial disorientation and low visibility. It noted that Captain Cade had not followed the safest return procedure. It noted irregularities in his rest schedule. It noted that the emergency locator signal had been briefly detected offshore, though never fixed to an exact position. It listed the probable cause as loss of control over open water. There was no wreckage large enough to examine. There were no bodies. The ocean became both grave and explanation. For most people, that was the shape the tragedy kept. Families marked birthdays with empty chairs. The Port Arden terminal hung a brass plaque near the departure doors. Meridian Shore Airways changed its name twice, merged once, and finally disappeared into a larger carrier whose executives knew Flight 217 only as a liability line in old insurance files. Captain Cade's widow, Sarah, moved inland after someone painted coward on her garage. His daughter, Lottie, grew up in a town where fathers lowered their voices when she entered a room. Iris Callow's sister did not move. Nola stayed in Port Arden and ran a small copy shop on East Harrow Street, 4 blocks from the airport bus stop. For years, she kept a drawer of Flight 217 clippings under the register, each one flattened and dated. She could not prove that Benton Price had lied, but she remembered the way Iris had sounded on the phone 2 days before the flight. Not frightened, not confused, angry. Iris had been a contract revenue auditor hired to reconcile fuel subsidies and rural route payments after Meridian Shore Airways nearly lost its island service grant. She was precise, private, and difficult to charm. She had found something in the accounts, something that made her stop answering work calls from the airline office and start making photocopies after midnight. On the afternoon before she vanished, she had called Nola from a payphone outside the customs warehouse and said, "If they say I changed my mind, don't believe it." Then she laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because she knew how dramatic she sounded. "If who says?" Nola asked. Iris had not answered directly. "I'll be on the island tomorrow morning. I'm giving the package to someone who can't bury it." That was all. The next night, Iris boarded Flight 217 with the brown briefcase. The briefcase was never recovered. In the early weeks, Nola told Detective Sharp about that call 3 times. Sharp listened. She wrote it down. She asked the airline for Iris's work files. Meridian Shore supplied 3 boxes of ordinary invoices, schedules, and fuel receipts. They also supplied a memo stating that Iris had completed her audit without major findings and had been traveling to Turnhaven to interview dock vendors about routine billing delays. The memo had Benton Price's signature at the bottom. Nola hated that signature for 37 years. She hated it through Sharp's retirement, through the demolition of the old terminal, through the year the brass plaque was moved into a storage hallway and then quietly reinstalled after families complained. She hated it when Benton became vice president of ground operations at the merged company. She hated it when he gave interviews on aviation safety anniversaries, his voice softened by age and public sorrow. She hated it most when he stood at the 20th memorial and told Captain Cade's daughter that her father had been a complicated man who met a complicated night. Lottie Cade was 26 then. She had inherited her father's long hands and his refusal to cry in public. She thanked Benton because everyone was watching. Later, she sat in Nola's copy shop until closing, reading old articles under the green desk lamp. "My mother says he was not reckless," Lottie said. "Mine says the dead can't defend themselves," Nola replied, and then apologized because she did not know why she had said mine when her mother had been gone for years. The case became old, in the way cases become old when nothing new enters them. Boxes were transferred, labels faded. A cassette copy of the Tower audio lost clarity every time it was played. The Harbor Police evidence room flooded once from a cracked pipe, though Flight 217's documents survived on a top shelf, smelling faintly of mildew. The airline's old operations tapes were destroyed after the statutory retention period. The civil radar logs were reduced to printouts that showed a clean disappearance east of the buoy line. There was one radar site no one in Port Arden had asked about in 1989 because almost no one knew it existed. Bishop Crown Station sat on a bare hill 51 miles inland, above a military testing corridor that had been decommissioned before the century turned. In 1989, its long-range radar watched the coast, the channel, the inland marshes, and the empty salt flats beyond the county line. Its records were not part of the civilian crash file. They were kept on magnetic reels, boxed, cataloged under defense infrastructure, and forgotten in a climate-controlled archive outside Ravillan City. 37 years after Flight 217 vanished, a graduate researcher named Dev Nair requested those reels for a project on obsolete radar artifacts. He was not looking for missing aircraft. He was studying how analog radar systems recorded weather interference near coastlines before modern filtering. The work was quiet, underfunded, and dull enough that his supervisor joked no one could weaponize boredom. Dev spent 3 weeks in a windowless digitization room, wearing cotton gloves and headphones that made his ears ache. The reels arrived with typed labels and brittle paper index cards. He ran them through a rebuilt reader one at a time, transferring sweeps into modern files that looked, to most people, like green dust over black water. On the fourth Friday at 1:13 in the afternoon, he paused a file from March 14, 1989. A return tagged with a 4-digit transponder code appeared near the outer channel, where it should have been if it belonged to Flight 217. Then it did something the official report said Flight 217 had never done. It turned inland. Dev thought first of duplication, then of ghosting, then of a bad calibration table. He backed up the file. The signal moved across the marsh, faint but continuous, descending from 6,000 feet to 4,000, then to 2,800, then lower. It crossed behind the civilian radar blind wedge, created by a line of coastal storage tanks, and emerged on the Bishop Crown sweeps as a clean, pulsing mark. Beside it, the transponder code held for 7 minutes. 4217, Flight 217's assigned code that night. Dev sat forward until the old chair creaked. The radar return did not fall into the sea. It did not spiral. It did not vanish in weather. It tracked northwest over dark farmland, passed south of Millhook Quarry, dropped below 500 feet, and ended at the edge of a pale, rectangular shape on the old base map. Lidstone Auxiliary Strip, a private runway built beside an abandoned salt works and removed from active charts in 1996. Dev checked the timestamp again. The signal ended 22 minutes after the airline said the plane had been lost at sea. For 10 minutes, he did nothing. The room hummed. A dust mote moved in the projector light. Outside, a delivery cart rolled down the archive corridor with one squeaking wheel. Then he printed the frame. The first person he called was not a reporter. It was the Regional Transportation Safety Office, where a clerk transferred him twice and then told him to send an email. The second person he called was his supervisor, who told him not to say the word proof until someone understood the format. The third call went to the Port Arden Police Department because the crash had involved missing persons, and, technically, no death certificates had ever been supported by remains. By Monday morning, Detective Ren Calder had the printed radar frame spread across his desk. Ren was 44, which made him younger than the case, and old enough to remember his mother turning off the television whenever Flight 217 anniversary coverage came on. His uncle had been one of the harbor volunteers who searched the channel. Ren had spent enough years with cold files to distrust miracles, and enough nights with grieving families to know that bad evidence sometimes looked like a miracle simply because it arrived late. He called Dev Nair into the station. He called 2 retired radar technicians. He called the transportation office. He called a records clerk in Ravelin City who did not appreciate being told that a reel from a closed military radar station might reopen one of the county's oldest wounds. By the end of that week, Ren understood 3 things. The Bishop Crown data was real. The code matched Flight 217, and someone in 1989 had either failed to compare the military radar record or had seen it and made sure it went nowhere. The press learned about the signal from a public records request that should have taken 20 days, but took 6 hours, because Port Arden was still small enough for secrets to move faster than paperwork. The headline appeared on a Wednesday morning, while fog lay over the harbor, and Nola Callow was unlocking the copy shop door. Radar track may show flight. 217 did not crash at sea. Nola read it twice before she remembered how to breathe. Across town, Lottie Cade was teaching a ground school class to teenagers who wanted private pilot licenses. One of her students showed her the headline on his phone without understanding that her father's name lived inside it. Lottie took the phone, read the first paragraph, and sat down on the edge of a plastic chair. For 37 years, the sea had been a wall. Now there was a line over land. Ren Calder did not let the story become simple too quickly. He held a press conference in the municipal building and said the new radar file required authentication. He said an inland track did not by itself explain what happened to the aircraft or the people aboard. He said families had been contacted before public release, though in truth, the public release had outrun half the calls. An elderly man in the back of the room asked whether this meant Captain Cade had hijacked his own plane. Ren paused before answering. "It means the official timeline may be wrong," he said. "We are going to find out how wrong." Benton Price watched the press conference from the breakfast room of the assisted living complex, where he had moved after a minor stroke left his right hand weak. He was 81, thin through the shoulders, still neat. His hair, once black and lacquered, had gone white and sparse. On the table beside him sat tea, half a grapefruit, and a folded newspaper with his own younger face in one of the anniversary photographs. A nurse named Oriel asked if he was all right. Benton smiled with only one side of his mouth. "Old ghosts," he said. Within an hour, his phone began ringing. He did not answer Nola Callow. He did not answer Lottie Cade. He did answer a former airline attorney in another state. And when that man said, "Is there anything still in writing?" Benton closed his eyes. "Not where they will look first," he said. Detective Calder's first practical problem was geography. Lidstone Auxiliary Strip no longer existed in any useful form. Its runway had been broken into sections during a redevelopment that never finished. The salt works beside it had become a fenced storage yard for irrigation pipe, then a failed ceramic tile plant, then a county equipment depot, then nothing. The land records were a nest of bankrupt companies and forgotten leases. The radar coordinates put Flight 217's final return near the northern end of the old runway, but the error margin was wide. Bishop Crown's sweep interval, outdated map projection, and uneven terrain meant the aircraft could have been anywhere inside a rough oval that included 3 concrete pads, a collapsed hangar, a drainage basin, and a low building called the iodine shed, because no one remembered what it had really stored. Ren walked the site with Dev Nair, 2 forensic surveyors, and a county engineer. It was late April. The air smelled of sun-warmed weeds and mineral dust. Beyond the fence, the old salt pans stretched flat and white, cut by black lines of cracked service roads. Nothing about the place looked like the bottom of a mystery. It looked like a place people had used badly and left behind. Dev held a tablet showing the radar overlay. The final mark blinked over the northern apron. "If the transponder stopped here," he said, "it could mean the aircraft landed and powered down." "Could mean it hit the ground," the engineer said. Dev nodded. "It could, but the descent profile is controlled. Slow, no emergency dive." Ren looked at the runway remains. Grass grew through long seams in the concrete. A faded yellow line disappeared beneath sand. At the far end, the collapsed hangar leaned inward, roof panels folded like paper. A rusted windsock pole stood bare against the sky. Someone had chosen this place because from the air it would look abandoned, and from the road it would look useless. The first ground search found nothing dramatic. No fuselage, no bones, no blackened scar. They found rusted drums, tire wire, broken tile, a 1970s soda can, 3 dead batteries, and a section of aircraft tie-down chain that could have belonged to any crop duster that ever used the strip. A cadaver dog showed interest near the iodine shed, then lost it in rodent tunnels and chemical residue. Ground-penetrating radar returned confusing shadows under the concrete pad, where heavy equipment had been parked for years. The case might have stalled there if not for a man named Emmett Voss, who lived in a trailer behind a pawn shop in Millhook and had spent most of his life telling people stories they learned not to believe. Emmett had been 19 in 1989, a night watchman at Lidstone Salt Products for exactly 11 weeks. He came to the police station after seeing the radar headline in the grocery store. He wore a clean shirt buttoned wrong and carried a plastic folder full of unrelated documents because he thought documents made people listen. The front desk nearly sent him away. Ren happened to be passing through the lobby and heard him say, "I saw a blue tail where there wasn't supposed to be any plane." Ren brought him upstairs. Emmett's story came out in pieces. On the night Flight 217 vanished, he had been sleeping in the watch office because the plant had barely operated, and no one checked on him. Sometime after 9, he heard aircraft engines low over the flats, not passing overhead. Landing. He went outside and saw a commuter plane roll without lights toward the northern hangar. Its tail had a blue stripe. A fuel truck was waiting. So was a white shuttle bus with curtains. He thought it was a government seizure. He thought it was smugglers. He thought, for a short and terrified time, that it was both. "Did you see people get off?" Ren asked. Emmett rubbed his thumb hard across the edge of the folder. "I saw shapes in the door. I saw a woman with something against her chest. Maybe a bag. Maybe she was holding herself. There were men moving fast. One had a coat with shiny cuffs. Not police. Airline coat." "What did you do?" "I kept being 19, Emmett said. "I hid behind the pump house." He had not come forward in 1989 because 2 men found him the next morning. One was a Lidstone supervisor. The other, Emmett said, was Benton Price. Benton told him that Flight 217 had crashed at sea, and that if Emmett repeated a confused night story during a national investigation, he would be charged with obstruction, trespassing, and theft from the salt works. There had been stolen tools in Emmett's car, tools he insisted a cousin had put there. He was young, poor, and already on probation for breaking a vending machine. "So I shut up," he said. "I kept shutting up until shutting up was all I knew how to do." Ren asked him to describe the aircraft coat. Emmett lifted his weak chin. Dark, silver braid at the wrist, like the one in the newspaper pictures, like Mr. Price wore when he cried with the families. Memory after 37 years was dangerous. It could be shaped by photographs, guilt, and the wish to be important before death. Ren knew that. He also knew Emmett had mentioned the white shuttle bus before any police statement included tire impressions found near the old hangar. They went back to Lidstone with a narrower purpose, Behind the collapsed hangar, under a mat of weeds and roofing scrap, the survey team found 2 parallel depressions filled with different soil from the rest of the yard. They were too short for a runway, too straight for drainage, and angled toward the old service road. When the ground-penetrating unit crossed them, the screen showed dense rectangular masses buried 5 feet down. The county obtained an excavation order. The first piece came up at 9:22 on a Saturday morning. A corroded aluminum panel no larger than a serving tray. White paint on one side, blue on the other. A mechanic from the Transportation Safety Office cleaned the edge with gloved fingers and went still. There were 3 rivet holes in a pattern used on the tail assembly of the model Meridian Shore flew in 1989. By noon, they found a section of cabin window frame. By 2, they found a bent seat track. By dusk, they uncovered a maintenance placard stamped with the aircraft's serial number. Flight 217 had not vanished at sea. It had been cut apart behind the Lidstone hangar. Wren stood at the edge of the excavation as the light went copper over the salt flats. For years, the families had thrown flowers into water. All that time, part of the plane had been under hard dirt and weeds, 50 miles inland. Waiting without drama, without waves, without horizon. Nola Callow arrived after dark because no one could stop her from driving there. She parked outside the fence and stood with both hands locked around the chain link. Lottie Cade came 15 minutes later. The 2 women did not embrace. They stood side by side while floodlights moved over the opened ground. "My father landed it," Lottie said. Wren, who had walked over to speak with them, answered carefully. "The radar says someone landed it." Lottie looked through the fence at the bent metal. "He could land in a crosswind with one engine, blindfolded, if someone talked him through the runway distance," she said. "If he put that plane here, he was alive when he did it." No one knew how to comfort that kind of hope because it was sharpened on dread. The discovery changed the investigation from accident review to homicide inquiry. It also made every old certainty unstable. The debris found at sea in 1989 had to be explained. The distress call had to be explained. The emergency locator signal had to be explained. The missing airline records had to be explained. And above all, the people had to be found. Wren brought the old boxes out of storage. The evidence labels had yellowed. The sea debris was still wrapped in brown paper, each item cataloged with tide position and recovery date. The child's red scarf, the torn safety card, the galley curtain, a piece of blue interior panel, seat foam, a flotation cushion with no serial stamp because the tag had been cut away. A forensic materials analyst examined the items under modern light and found what the original report had not asked about. The hydraulic fluid on the galley curtain was not aircraft hydraulic fluid. It was a common industrial fluid used in loading equipment. The seat foam edges were cut clean with a blade. The blue interior panel had paint from a Meridian Shore aircraft, but not necessarily from Flight 217. The red scarf had never been soaked long enough to drift for days in open water. Salt crystals formed only on its outer fibers, as if it had been dipped and dried. Someone had manufactured a crash for the sea to perform. The tower audio created a second problem. The cassette held the famous distress fragment. For decades, families had listened to it in court hearings, documentaries, and private rituals they later regretted. The voice beneath the static had always been identified as Captain Cade, though the official report admitted the quality was poor. A modern audio lab separated the layers. The engine noise under the words did not match an aircraft cockpit microphone. It had a boxy echo, a room around it. There was a faint metallic rattle after the phrase, the kind made by a loose desk fan cage. Behind the final burst of static, almost buried, was another sound, a telephone ringing twice in the distance. Captain Cade had not transmitted those words from Flight 217. Someone had broadcast them from an indoor radio. Wren asked for every photograph of the Meridian Shore operations room taken in 1989. Most showed smiling staff, ribbon cuttings, weather boards, and Christmas garlands over dispatch desks. In one newspaper photograph, behind Benton Price's left shoulder, sat a gray desk fan with a dented cage. Beside it was a base station radio capable of transmitting on company frequency. The lie had not been told from the sky, it had been told from a desk. Benton Price's lawyer sent a letter saying Mr. Price's health prevented extended interviews and that he had cooperated fully in all historic inquiries. Wren went anyway with another detective, June Hollis, whose patience in interview rooms had made stronger men keep talking out of embarrassment. Benton received them in a private lounge at the assisted living complex. He wore a cardigan over a pressed shirt. On the wall behind him hung a framed photograph of a Meridian Shore aircraft lifting over blue water. His right hand rested curled in his lap. "I have expected you for a week," he said. Wren placed the radar printout on the table, then a photograph of the excavated panel, then the audio analysis summary. Benton looked at each without touching them. "You're building certainty from damaged things," Benton said. "That happens in old cases." Old cases also attract people who want to correct their lives by changing their memories. Wren nodded. "You mean Emmett Voss?" "I mean anyone." June leaned forward. "Mr. Price, did you know Flight 217 landed at Lidstone?" Benton's eyes moved from her to the window. Outside, an orderly pushed a woman in a wheelchair beneath blooming pear trees. "I knew many things later than I should have," he said. "It was the first crack. Not a confession. Not even an admission. A sentence built with enough fog to hide inside." Wren asked about Iris Callow. Benton's mouth tightened. "She was a temporary auditor. She found something. She found patterns she did not understand." "What patterns?" Benton turned his good hand palm up on the chair arm, as if showing it empty. "Rural aviation was not clean in those days, Detective. Grants, fuel allotments, mail contracts, island subsidies. Every carrier bent to survive. That is not murder." "No," Wren said, "but 11 missing people is." Benton closed his eyes for so long, June thought he might have fallen asleep. When he opened them, they were wet, though nothing in his face had changed. "You think one person can do what you're describing?" "I think one person can start it," Wren said. "Then he needs help." Benton did not answer another substantive question, but after they left, his lawyer called twice in one day, asking what charges the county was considering. Fear, unlike grief, did not age as gracefully. The help Benton needed had names. The first was Lowell Quaid, Meridian Shore's majority owner in 1989, dead 12 years by the time the radar signal surfaced. Quaid had been celebrated locally as the man who kept island flights affordable. His foundation funded maritime scholarships. His portrait still hung in the Turnhaven Clinic. Old financial records showed something less generous. Meridian Shore had been insolvent by early 1989. The airline survived on advance subsidy payments, inflated fuel claims, and a rotating debt arrangement with shell companies that leased equipment back to itself at impossible rates. Iris Callow's audit was supposed to be routine. Instead, she noticed that Flight 217 and 2 other island routes had carried phantom freight loads on paper, creating reimbursement claims for weight that never existed. She found invoices for fuel never pumped, emergency parts never installed, and charter segments flown only in ledgers. The missing money was not one theft, it was a system. The second helper was Orson Kett, a radio technician and part-time dispatcher who left Port Arden 6 weeks after the disappearance and later died in a motel fire in another county. Kett's old storage unit, auctioned after his death, had been bought by a retired school custodian who kept everything because he believed useful objects came around again. In a box of radio parts, detectives found a handwritten frequency card for Meridian Shore base operations, a spare microphone, and a strip of masking tape labeled C-tape, 2 finda. The tape itself was gone. The label was enough to show that something had been prepared. The third helper was harder to identify because his role had been hidden under ordinary labor. Someone at Lidstone had arranged access to the auxiliary strip, fuel, lights, storage space, and machinery capable of cutting apart an aircraft. Company payroll ledgers from the salt works were incomplete, but Emmett Voss remembered a supervisor everyone called Mr. Sable because his real name, Sabin Ellard, was printed on a badge he wore backward. Ellard had died in 2004. His daughter still lived in Millhook. She consented to a search of old family boxes after Wren showed her the radar track. In a rusted recipe tin, wrapped in wax paper, they found 4 cash deposit slips from March 1989. The amounts were just under the reporting threshold of the time. On the back of one slip, someone had written, "AS, clear by dawn." Lidstone auxiliary strip, clear by dawn. The line did not say what had been cleared. It did not need to. Nola Callow was allowed to see copies of Iris's recovered audit notes only after they were processed, cataloged, and argued over by 2 agencies. They had not been in the official boxes. They were found in an off-site storage room rented by a law firm that once represented Meridian Shore during the subsidy investigation that quietly followed the crash. The storage bill had been paid automatically for years by a trust that no longer existed. Iris's notes were inside a red expanding file labeled Catering Contracts. Her handwriting marched across yellow legal pads with controlled fury. Fuel weights, tail numbers, subsidy claims, initials, question marks. On the last page, written larger than the rest, was one sentence. BP has the authority to ground a plane, redirect a plane, or make a plane disappear on paper. Nola read that line in a police conference room with both hands flat beside the page. She did not cry. The grief had had 37 years to change forms. What shook her was not surprise, but recognition. Iris had seen the door closing and left a handprint on it. "There should be more," Nola said. Wren nodded. "We think there was a briefcase." "The brown one?" "Yes. She took it on the flight. We have not found it." Nola looked at the photocopied page again. "Then you still don't know what they did to her after the landing?" No one in the room answered. The answer came from the iodine shed. The building had looked useless during the first search. Concrete walls, broken windows, old chemical staining, swallow nests, and a floor half covered in wind-blown grit. The ground radar showed scattered anomalies under it, but chemical contamination made excavation expensive and legally slow. For 2 months, county attorneys argued with landowners, insurers, environmental consultants, and a company that claimed no responsibility because it had bought only surface rights in 2011. The families waited through those 2 months with a bitterness that had no place to go. When the floor was finally opened, workers found a narrow maintenance pit beneath a layer of concrete poured after the shed was built. The pit ran along the east wall and ended at a bricked service alcove. Inside the alcove were 2 aircraft oxygen bottles, a rotten canvas satchel, a woman's low-heeled shoe, 3 airline meal trays, and a cluster of human remains covered by lime and mineral dust. The first identification came not from DNA, which was degraded by chemicals, and time, but from dental work recorded in an island clinic file copied after the crash. The remains belonged to Nadia Pell, the cabin attendant. 2 days later, they found more remains in a second sealed space beyond the rear wall, where an old brine channel had been closed with cinder blocks. The work slowed to hand tools, brushes, and silence. 11 lives had been moved from air to concrete to rumor. No one at the site spoke louder than necessary. Captain Elias Cade was identified by a healed fracture in his left wrist from a crash training accident in 1978. First Officer Tova Sen by a surgical plate in her ankle. A teenage passenger by orthodontic records his mother had kept in a scrapbook. The retired nun by a rosary fragment made of olive wood, still caught in a fold of cloth near her ribs. The others followed with awful patience. Iris Callow was found last. She was not in the alcove with the passengers. She was beneath the collapsed office at the far end of the shed, separated by 20 feet and a poured curb. Near her were brass latches from a briefcase, a corroded fountain pen, and pieces of carbon paper fused together by damp. The leather and paper had decayed beyond reading, but the position mattered. She had been taken apart from the others. Wren imagined the landing because investigators always do, even when imagination is not evidence. Flight 217 came in low over the flats, no runway lights except vehicle beams and 2 portable lamps. Captain Cade would have known within seconds that this was not an emergency diversion arranged through proper channels. He would have seen no fire crews, no ambulance, no tower. He would have kept his hands on the controls until the plane stopped, because pilots do not abandon the living while engines still turn. Maybe Benton boarded at the foot of the stairs. Maybe Lowell Quaid waited in the shuttle bus. Maybe Iris recognized Benton's voice and understood in one instant that the sea was the story prepared for everyone else. The passengers might have been told there was a security issue, a fuel leak, a need to wait in the shed. They might have believed it for a few minutes, because people believe officials when darkness, machinery, and fear gather around them. Then the doors closed. The exact method would never be described in court beyond what evidence required. There was no need to turn suffering into spectacle. The charge was murder. The shape was enough. But the investigation still needed to prove who had made the shape. Benton Price's old house in Port Arden had been sold twice and renovated badly. In the garage attic, behind insulation and mouse droppings, the current owner found a metal dispatch case after hearing about the renewed search. The case bore no name. Inside were maps of Lidstone Auxiliary Strip, a key to the North Gate, a typed draft of the public statement Meridian Shore issued the morning after the disappearance, and a handwritten passenger manifest with one difference from the official copy. Beside Iris Callow's name, in Benton's handwriting, were 3 letters: HVT. High-value target was a phrase no small-town airline needed for a revenue auditor unless the flight had become an operation. There was also a list of phone numbers. One belonged to Lowell Quaid's private office, one to Orson Kett, one to Sabin Ellard at Lidstone Salt Products, one to a payphone at the Port Arden Customs Warehouse, the same place Iris had called Nola. Wren read the list 3 times and felt the case, after months of scattered evidence, begin to harden. Benton's lawyer argued the dispatch case could have been planted, misunderstood, or inherited from another executive. The handwriting expert was careful rather than dramatic. She said the manifest notations were highly consistent with Benton's known writing from 1989. She did not say impossible to dispute, because science rarely gives detectives the words they want. June Hollis found the stronger human evidence. She located a former Meridian Shore ticket agent named Celeste Moore, 87, living with her grandson in a yellow house near the old ferry road. Celeste had dementia in patches. Some mornings, she thought her husband was still in the garden. Some afternoons, she remembered every ticket coupon she had ever torn. June visited 4 times, never pushing, always bringing copies of photographs. On the 4th visit, Celeste touched Iris Callow's picture and said, "She was not meant to be on that plane." June kept her voice neutral. "Why do you say that?" "Benton took her ticket from me." "When?" "After boarding. He said the count was wrong. He said if anyone asked, she bought at the counter and paid cash. But she didn't. She had a voucher from the grant office. I remember because the paper was green." "Did you tell anyone?" Celeste's eyes shifted to the window, where laundry moved on a line. Mr. Price told me I had confused her with the dentist. I was new. I had 2 children. I decided to be confused. June asked about the brown briefcase. Celeste nodded. He asked if she checked it. I said no, it was in her hand. He was angry, but the kind of angry that smiles. That sentence went into the affidavit. The case moved outward again. Airline grant office records showed Iris had been scheduled to take the morning ferry, not the night flight. A ferry cancellation had forced her to ask for a seat on Flight 217. The diversion plan, then, had been arranged quickly, not over weeks. It explained the crude sea debris, the unreliable distress audio, the use of lidstone, and the number of mistakes covered only by time and authority. Wren began to understand the panic beneath the precision. Benton and Lowell Quaid had not planned to erase 11 people when the sun came up that day. They had planned to delay Iris, frighten her, take her briefcase, perhaps discredit her audit through accusation and paperwork. But the ferry cancellation put her on an aircraft with witnesses. The airline had one asset Benton controlled completely: flight movement. He could change routing, radio instructions, transponder expectations, ground response, family notification, and records. So he made the aircraft disappear where his authority was strongest. On paper first. Then in the world. The trial began in November of 2026 in a courthouse where the hallways could not hold the families, reporters, aviation historians, and townspeople who had spent decades repeating the wrong story. Benton arrived in a wheelchair, which made some spectators uncomfortable and others furious. Age had thinned him, but it had not made him harmless. That was the distinction the prosecutor returned to again and again. The state could not try Lowell Quaid, Orson Kett, or Sabin Ellard. They were dead. It could try the man who reported Flight 217 missing at sea while the aircraft was cooling on an inland strip. Benton pleaded not guilty. The defense suggested Captain Cade had diverted voluntarily for criminal reasons, and that Benton discovered the truth only later, too frightened of scandal to correct the record. They pointed to Cade's debts. They pointed to old rumors. They asked why a guilty man would comfort families for decades instead of leaving town. They called the radar file complicated, Emmett Voss unreliable, Iris's notes incomplete, and the sea debris ambiguous. For a few hours, the old lie tried to stand again. Then Dev Nair explained the radar frames to the jury without drama. Sweep by sweep, he showed the track leaving the official crash site, crossing inland, descending, and ending at Lidstone. He explained the transponder code. He explained why weather could not create a coded response. He explained that the signal did not prove motive, murder, or guilt by itself. It proves, he said, that the aircraft identified as Flight 217 was still flying after it was reported lost at sea, and that it traveled to the area of Lidstone Auxiliary Strip. Captain Cade's daughter lowered her head. Not in shame, in release. The audio expert played the cleaned distress call. The courtroom heard the old words, thin under static. Going down now. Then the expert isolated the room tone, the fan rattle, the distant telephone. A juror glanced toward Benton. Benton watched the table. Emmett Voss testified with both hands gripping the witness box. He admitted his probation. He admitted the stolen tools. He admitted he had told versions of the story badly in bars and been laughed at. Then he described the aircraft rolling without lights, the waiting bus, the blue-striped tail, and Benton's visit the next morning. "Why come forward now?" the prosecutor asked. Emmett swallowed. "Because the radar saw it too," he said. "And I am tired of being the only liar in my own life." Nola Callow testified about Iris's phone call. The defense objected twice and was overruled once. She did not embellish. She repeated the words exactly as she had carried them for 37 years. If they say I changed my mind, don't believe it. When shown Iris's recovered audit notes, Nola touched the page with one finger, but did not look at Benton. Lottie Cade testified last among the family witnesses. The prosecutor asked what the original report had done to her father's memory. Lottie took a breath. "It made him the last mistake," she said. "Every anniversary, every article, every safety lecture. He was the man who failed at the end. But the radar shows he kept flying. The landing gear marks show he put the airplane down. The remains show he did not leave his passengers. So whatever happened after, the last thing my father did as a pilot was not vanish into the sea. It was land." No one in the courtroom moved for several seconds. Benton did not confess on the stand because he did not testify. He did not give the families the clean line of guilt they wanted. The truth had to be built without his generosity. That was fitting in a way Wren disliked, but understood. Benton had controlled the first story with his voice. He would not be allowed to control the last one with silence. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They found Benton Price guilty on 11 counts of murder, conspiracy, falsification of transportation records, obstruction, and evidence tampering. Some of the lesser charges were ceremonial after so many years. The murder counts were not. At sentencing, Benton was invited to speak. His lawyer touched his shoulder, perhaps advising him not to. Benton stood with help from a bailiff. His voice, when it came, was softer than it had been in the old television clips, but the room recognized its carefulness. "I did not intend for that many people to die," he said. A sound moved through the gallery, not quite a gasp, not quite speech. Benton looked toward the families, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, seemed unable to choose the safest next word. It became impossible to undo. Nola Callow closed her eyes. Lottie Cade stared at him, as if looking at a weathered instrument that had finally shown its true reading. The judge said intention had many doors, and Benton had walked through each one. The diversion, the false call, the sea debris, the threat to Emmett Voss, the comfort offered to families while evidence lay inland, the decades in which children grew up inside a lie and the dead were blamed for their own disappearance. Benton was sentenced to die in prison. Though everyone in the room knew Age had already written most of that sentence, it did not matter. The point was not how many years remained to him. The point was that the lie no longer had public shelter. In the spring after the trial, the families gathered at Lidstone instead of the harbor. The old auxiliary strip had been cleared of weeds. The county did not rebuild it or polish it into something pretty. They placed a low stone marker near the northern apron where the radar return ended. It listed the 11 names without ranks, without blame, without the phrase lost at sea. Captain Elias Cade, First Officer Tova Sen, Nadia Pell, Iris Callow, and the passengers whose families had spent 37 years looking in the wrong direction. Nola brought no flowers. She brought a copy of Iris's last audit page sealed in glass. She set it against the marker and weighted it with a small stone from the copy shop doorstep. For years, she had imagined the truth rising from water. Instead, it had come from old magnetic dust, from a green pulse recorded by a machine no one remembered to ask. Lottie Cade walked the broken runway alone before the ceremony. She stopped where the concrete dipped near the final taxi scar. The wind moved over the salt flats in a dry sheet. She tried to picture her father's hands on the controls, the runway appearing out of darkness, the knowledge that something was wrong waiting at the edge of the landing lights. She did not know whether he had been afraid. She decided fear did not erase skill. At the harbor, the old plaque remained for 3 more weeks because municipal removal required a vote. When workers finally unscrewed it from the terminal wall, a pale rectangle stayed behind in the paint. People took photographs of that pale space as if absence had become an exhibit. The new plaque, installed later, did not mention the sea, except to say the sea had been searched because people believed what they were told. Ren Calder kept one copy of the radar printout in the case file and one in his desk for longer than he admitted. The image was not impressive to anyone who did not understand it. A small coded mark crossing black space, a patient line refusing the story built around it. To Ren, it was the moment the case stopped drowning. Dev Nair returned to his research. Reporters called him the man who found Flight 217, which embarrassed him because the flight had never been lost in the way people meant. It had been hidden. There was a difference. Lost things waited for luck. Hidden things waited for someone's power to weaken. Emmett Voss moved to a smaller trailer closer to his sister. Once a month, he drove to Lidstone and sat outside the fence, not at the marker, but near the pump house, where a 19-year-old version of himself had chosen silence. No one forgave him publicly. He did not ask them to. He had given the truth what he could when he could, late and damaged, which was still more than the men who had made him afraid. Nola closed the copy shop at the end of that summer. She taped a note to the door thanking customers for 32 years and asking them not to leave packages in the rain. In the emptied back room, she found the drawer of clippings and carried it home without opening it. The next morning, she mailed Lottie Cade a photograph of Iris standing beside Captain Cade at the gate on the night of the flight. Neither woman had known the photograph existed until it appeared in a newspaper archive after the trial. Iris was looking down at her boarding envelope. Captain Cade was reaching for the manifest. Behind them, through the terminal glass, Benton Price stood in the operations room, watching. Lottie placed the photograph in a plain frame on her office shelf at the flight school. She did not display it as tragedy. She displayed it as correction. Years from then, when students asked about Flight 217, she did not begin with the crash, because there had been no crash at sea. She did not begin with Benton Price, because he had already been given too many beginnings. She began with the landing. She told them a pilot in darkness brought a plane down on a strip that should not have been waiting. She told them records can lie, voices can be staged, debris can be planted, and institutions can grieve in public while hiding what they did in private. She told them a radar signal is not a conscience, but sometimes it can preserve what conscience refuses. Then she pointed to the old printout on the wall, where a coded mark crossed from water toward land. That, she said, is where the truth turned.